I think it's still good morning, and thank you all for being here. I'm truly honored and privileged to be here. And I realize that we do have time constraints, although the chair did not say. So we have an hour each.
You have 20 minutes.
I am from Sudan, and I left Sudan in 1985 following the execution of my mentor, Ustaz Mahmoud Muhammad Taha, for apostasy. So I lived with this personally for a long time, and before that too. And I think just now talk about remarks about persecution of Christians. In fact, there is more persecution of Muslims than there is persecution of Christians by other Muslims, not necessarily, obviously not elsewhere. So we have to think of the intra-religious persecution and violation of the freedom of religion, as well as inter-religious. It's not only always inter-religious. Just a remark on the title and so on. I happen to take the title very seriously. International religious freedom and the clash of values. And I think when we do that, well, the Human Rights Project is a project. It has not yet succeeded. It can fail totally. And there could soon be a time when we don't talk about human rights, which is fine, because there was life and a world before human rights, and there will be after human rights. There is nothing sacred, there is nothing permanent about anything, of course, including human rights. While we are dealing with the project, take it seriously or leave it. Either say that, yes, I do mean we are talking about rights to every human being by virtue of their humanity, no mention of religion, of race, of gender, of anything, just simply for being human, I'm entitled to these claims. Either that, or we are not talking about human rights at all. And I think the whole difficulty is in precisely the devil in the details. When we come to be specific about what we mean about human rights, that's where our disagreement comes up. The concept of human rights is really easy to accept. Everybody will say, yes, of course, human rights are a good thing. The content is problematic and challenging and extremely recent. Let me be clear here. The American Declaration of Independence was not a human rights document. The French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen was not a human rights document. Those were constitutional documents that spoke of the rights of citizens of those countries, but not of humanity at large. The main difference between human rights and other types of rights is that they are the rights of the human as human globally, everywhere, all the time. Now, looking at the question of religious freedom, I think that the concept and the content as defined so far has privileged Christianity and privileged Westphalian states. So the concept is constructed around the idea of the territorial nation state as the primary violator of rights and as the primary protector of rights. Presumably, and which is there is a paradox in that, is how to expect the state to protect rights against itself. But also the question of the religion we seem to talk about, the religion that we visualize is Christianity primarily. To some extent, Islam as the other. But there are many other religions, and by the way, this goes to Tom Farr's question about why religion and belief. Because there are belief systems which would not qualify as religions by any definition. So either you keep a term religion coherent and define it in a way that will exclude some other belief systems, or you add this category so that it's a sort of a catch-all type of category that will cover, like for example, traditional African religions. They are not religions by the measure of Christianity or Islam or Judaism or and so on, but they are, to their people they are religions, or as much as we would like to protect our religion and so on. So that point, I think it's important. One point I think we can bear in mind is that Christianity does not have a Sharia. It should have had. I believe that you had the Sharia and you dropped it along the way for all sorts of reasons. Sorry, by you I mean Christians. But Muslims have Sharia, and it's a highly articulated, highly specific, and developed normative system, which is binding on Muslims all the time, everywhere. So to speak of Christianity and Islam as if they are equivalent and therefore Muslims should do this as Christians do that is unfair, is unrealistic. And as a Muslim myself who has been an advocate of human rights since I was a student in law school in the 1960s, I will put it bluntly. If I'm confronted with the choice of being Muslim or being a human rights advocate, I will choose being Muslim all the time, any day. There is no question. Human rights cannot compete with religion for a believer. So we have to find a language, a way in which we can induce people to speak about these values in a way that comes to some sort of consensus about them. So the clash of values is real, and it is permanent, and is a human right in itself. You know, the Common Article 1 of the two covenants speaks about the right to self-determination, which is the right to be governed by the system and politics and so on that you choose. And that means that people will make those choices. Albie Sachs, the South African constitutional lawyer, said that human rights are about the right to be the same and the right to be different. So being different is permanent. There will never be a time, when people are the same. Within the same family, within the same community, let alone across the world. So if we are going to succeed with the project of universal human rights, we have to deal with the fact of difference as permanent. That people are not going to accept our definition of anything, and we will not accept their definition of anything. We have to negotiate. We have to achieve some level of consensus over time. Now, the notion of minority and majority also is problematic too, because I think that we tend to identify them as static categories. But in fact, all of us, everyone, is a member of minorities in some respect and majorities in other respects. So there is no one who is a minority all the time in every respect, or a majority all the time in every respect. By that I mean simply that we should not privilege the category of religion as defining who is a minority and majority to the exclusion of all other categories. Politically, I'm not a minority. Socioeconomically, I'm not a minority. So in the United States, that's where I live now. But religiously, I am as a Muslim. But as a Muslim, I am more in agreement with some other Americans who are not Muslims than I am with other Muslims. So it is a bit complex and more problematic than we tend to think of. Now, quickly to move on, I know that I'm already almost half my time. I mentioned briefly what I call the double paradox. There are two permanent paradoxes in the human rights movement. One is the paradox of universality, which is how can we have agreed norms despite our permanent difference of culture and values, as the title says. So that is a paradox. The other paradox is the paradox of expecting the state to protect human rights against itself. And these two paradoxes has to be mediated. They cannot be resolved categorically. So we will not have a time when we will agree on exactly what we mean by any of the rights. And the rights, by the way, all of them are conflictual. There is conflict within each and every of the human rights that we talk about. We are talking about freedom of religion. If you talk about freedom of speech, or you will find that there are competing definitions of that term, and so on. I think that the purpose of my remarks is to highlight this, to say that if we mean to take the Human Rights Project seriously, we have to take difference seriously. And we cannot really project our own understanding and definitions as universal. That's what cultural imperialism is. Human rights are about rights which are defined internationally to be applied locally. Because violations of human rights always happen on the ground, in real time and place. It's always within the jurisdiction and territory of a sovereign state that human rights are violated. And therefore, to access those violations, to remedy those violations, we have to deal with the reality of the sovereign state. So that is something, and that sovereign state will reflect the interests and values and so on of its population. So we have to deal with that. We cannot afford not to do it. But I'm saying that it is always in real time and place that we have to identify the problems and address them as remedies. But the international dimension is in defining the rights. But what is going on in the United States, which I objected to yesterday, and with Tom, we have been doing this for 15 years now, is the United States is doing the exact opposite. It is refusing to subscribe to and be part of the international human rights protection. It has not accepted a single human rights treaty without reservations that mean that it will not change any of its laws to fit the treaty that is being adopted. This goes back to the Bricker Amendment of 1953, when the Eisenhower administration agreed with the Senate that they will not submit human rights treaties to ratification. And that when that happens, that the ratification will not mean any change in US domestic law. So the US does not play by the international standards at all, and yet it is claiming to project its own domestic standard as universal by calling the International Religious Freedom Act. So that is what the point I was making. Now, before I run out of time, let me move on to the Islamic dimension. Because my point is to say that let us all be self-critical of our cultures, of our value systems, so that we can promote trust and understanding across cultural boundaries and value systems, so that we can have a consensus. So my work has been about criticizing, and as I said, I mentioned the experience personally of having to leave Sudan because of this, to say that I'm willing to be critical of Sharia, and I have ways of doing so, and I oppose the application of Sharia by the state. I argue that there is no such thing as an Islamic state. It is utter nonsense. The state can never be Islamic. Sharia cannot be enforced by the state. Sharia ceases to be Sharia by the very act of enacting it as a state law. It becomes the political will of the state and not the religious law of Islam. So the whole Islamist project is a total fallacy. But it's a fallacy that is gripping the hearts and minds of Muslims progressively because they are not able to challenge the core claim. The idea, therefore, is how to promote the space for Muslims to challenge that core claim, obviously not by invading countries and by destabilizing regions. When you invade country and occupy country illegally, recklessly, like the United States and Britain did in Iraq, you are repudiating the very foundations of international law and international understanding. And the possibility people like myself get totally legitimized. And either I am utterly naive, or I am totally a stooge or an agent of the CIA or something, if I will keep talking about human rights and international law in the face of such flagrant violations which do not meet any level of accountability. The illegal, destructive, reckless invasion of Iraq has not been met by any accountability. Where? When? Is it even criticized or talked about? And yet we now talk about ISIS. We look at ISIS as if it's a new threat. Where did ISIS come from? Where was ISIS 5 years, 10 years ago? So we tend to really decontextualize completely and naively, I think. So the point for me is to go on to say that I am willing, and I have for decades, presented a critique of Sharia as something that is human and not divine, as something that is constructed through human interpretation of divine sources, yes, but by virtue of the fallibility of those who construct it, it cannot be immutable. And that it is possible, in fact, to make a very powerful case against the death penalty or any legal consequence to apostasy. And that is in the paper. Unfortunately, I have now to refer to the paper, and I hope that Mark will share it with you. That I'm happy that it is a draft, but you can share it so that you understand really the bulk of my argument. That argument can be made and have been made for decades. Not only by myself, but many others. But the credibility and the saliency of that argument is undermined by the sort of discourse that I heard in this room, and the sort of views that as if there is a problem with Islam. Actually, there is a problem with Christianity too. And there is a problem with Judaism, there is a problem of Hinduism. Depending who you are and where you are, you will have problems with others. And if there are no problems, there is no need for human rights. The ethos of human rights presupposes that we have problems, not presupposes that we are all in agreement and happy together and so on. And that is the sort of attitude that we have to come to the issues with. If we do, then we will find ways of negotiating our differences. So I do take the example of apostasy as an example where a totally different attitude can prevail among Muslims, and it does in fact prevail among the vast majority of Muslims. If I have a minute, I will just say this. There is 1.8 billion Muslims in the world. It is the second largest religion. There is more than 40 countries where Muslims are the predominant majority. A quarter of the UN membership are countries where Muslims are the majority. And as a quarter of humanity are Muslims. If the attitudes and the focus on the negative this and that we get, if that is an Islamic position, human life would not be possible. If you have 1.8 billion Muslim terrorists, if you have 1.40 countries where the majority are Muslims, therefore will pursue Sharia, where do you hear about Sharia being promoted as a state legal system? In how many countries? All of you in this room should know this it's obvious. If you follow news at all, you are talking about 3, 4, 5, 6 countries out of 40. And now being a rational, scientific-minded, post-Enlightenment Europeans, how can you judge by a tiny minority being the representative of the vast majority? How can you take a tiny number of countries where the issue is an issue at all? From Senegal to Indonesia to Central Asia. When you do that, how can you take it to be so so confusing and blocking all visibility? So the time is up for me, and I hope I have raised some points that will enable me to come back during discussion. But the one point I would like to finish with is that the Human Rights Project is a project. I know many Muslims like myself are willing to invest in that project, but our ability to invest is contingent on the willingness of others to take it as seriously as we do. But if it is just seen as a vehicle of the civilizing mission of the white man, if it is just seen as an extension of the colonial project, then I, for one, will stand to oppose it as soon as that comes to be the case. Thank you very much.